There is a photograph in a Smithsonian archive, catalogued in the 1880s, showing a young Apache man staring directly into the camera. The anthropologist who took it wrote a single word on the back: nomad. That word would define how an entire nation was understood for the next century. Wanderers of the desert, people without a permanent home, a society that appeared in the southwest the way a storm appears on the horizon, sudden, fierce, and without warning. That story is not wrong because it is cruel. It is wrong because it is short. Before the deserts of Arizona, before the canyons of New Mexico, before Spanish soldiers wrote frightened reports about raiders they could not predict, the ancestors of the Apache were somewhere else entirely. They were 3,000 miles away, in the subarctic forests of what is now Canada, in a world of snow, spruce, and rivers that froze solid for half the year. Their language belonged to a family found almost nowhere else on the continent, a family that connects them not to their neighbors in the desert, but to peoples living near the Arctic Circle. Something moved them. Something carried a language, a set of survival skills, and a genetic signature across an entire continent, through terrain and climates that could not be more different from where they began. History books treated the Apache like they had always been there, one more tribe on one more patch of desert. DNA and linguistics tell a different story, a story of the longest confirmed indigenous migration in North American history. And when researchers began comparing genetic markers found among Apache and Navajo populations with those found among Athabaskan-speaking peoples of the far north, the old story of the timeless desert nomad began to fall apart. The first surprise was not that Apache history involved movement. Apache oral tradition already spoke of a long journey, generations of travel remembered in stories passed from elder to child. Linguists had long known that Apache and Navajo belonged to a language family called Dene, and that the closest living relatives of that family were spoken not in the southwest, but thousands of miles north, among peoples like the Dene, the Tlingit, and other subarctic and Pacific Northwest nations. This connection was so precise that trained linguists could identify grammatical patterns shared between an Apache elder in Arizona and a Dene speaker in the Northwest Territories of Canada, patterns too specific to be coincidence. The surprise was not that a journey happened. The surprise was how long it took to prove it, how difficult it was to explain, and how much the genetic evidence would eventually reveal about who joined that journey along the way, and who was already waiting in the southwest when it ended. For decades, archaeologists debated when Athabaskan-speaking ancestors of the Apache and Navajo actually arrived in the southwest. Written Spanish records only begin in the 16th century, and by then, Apache and Navajo communities were already established across a wide territory. That left a troubling gap. If the migration happened before Spanish contact, how long before? Centuries, a single generation, multiple waves over hundreds of years. Archaeology alone struggled to answer this because the material culture of early Apache and Navajo sites did not always leave clear, datable markers that separated newcomers from long-established populations. Pottery styles, housing structures, and tool types can be ambiguous. People adopt new technologies from neighbors. They abandon old ones. A campsite does not carry a passport. Then researchers began comparing genetic markers across Dene-speaking populations, from the subarctic all the way to the American Southwest. Certain lineages, both on the maternal and paternal sides, appeared in Apache and Navajo populations that matched distinctly patterns found among northern Athabaskan-speaking peoples in Canada and Alaska. These were not the common lineages found broadly across most indigenous populations of the Americas. These were specific, traceable signatures, genetic fingerprints that pointed north, and only north, to a homeland thousands of miles from the desert. That did not prove every detail of the journey. It did not reveal exactly which route was taken, or how many generations the migration spanned. But it did prove that a population, carrying both a distinct language and a distinct genetic signature, had moved from the subarctic into the southwest, and that this movement was large enough and recent enough to leave a clear and lasting mark, both in speech and in DNA. That matters because it changes everything about how the Apache story should be told. Their history did not begin when Spanish colonizers first encountered them in the 16th century. It did not begin when they were pushed onto reservations in the 19th century. It did not even begin when they mastered the deserts and mountains of the Southwest, becoming some of the most skilled desert survivalists in human history. Their story began further back and further north, in a homeland shaped by ice, cold rivers, and short summers. A homeland that demanded an entirely different set of survival knowledge than the one their descendants would later need. And this is where the mystery becomes dangerous to the old version of history. For generations, outsiders described the Apache mainly through conflict, through raids, through the wars fought against Mexican and American forces that stretched across decades. Names like Geronimo, Cochise, and Victorio became symbols of resistance, but also became the entire story, as if the Apache existed only in relation to the people fighting them. Their deeper history, the astonishing journey that brought their ancestors across a continent, was reduced to a footnote or left out entirely. But a migration of this scale does not happen without extraordinary social knowledge, without networks of information passed between bands, without an ability to adapt survival strategies to radically different environments. The desert warriors that Spanish and American forces struggled to defeat were not born from nothing. They were the descendants of a people who had already proven, over centuries and thousands of miles, that they could adapt to almost anything. The genetic evidence does not turn the Apache into strangers who arrived and displaced everyone else in the Southwest. It does something more complicated and more human. It places their ancestors on one of the longest documented journeys in the human history of this continent, a journey that eventually intersected with peoples who had already lived in the Southwest for thousands of years. The land the Apache eventually made their own was never empty. Ancestral Puebloan peoples and various other indigenous nations of the desert Southwest had built complex societies there for millennia before Athabaskan speakers arrived. What the genetic and archaeological record increasingly suggests is not a story of simple replacement, but a story of arrival, contact, exchange, and in some cases, absorption. Small groups of northern travelers entering a landscape already full of history and slowly, over generations, becoming something new while never fully leaving behind who they had been. So what did researchers actually test, and how confident can we be in this 3,000-mile connection? The evidence is not one dramatic sample from one perfect skeleton. It is a convergence of multiple independent lines of investigation. Linguists mapped shared vocabulary, grammar, and sound patterns across the entire Dene family, spanning from Alaska to Arizona, patterns far too specific and too systematic to have developed independently in two unrelated populations. Geneticists studied lineages on the Y chromosome, passed from father to son, and on mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child, searching for markers that connected southern Athabaskan populations, the Apache and Navajo, to their northern relatives. Archaeologists examined material culture, tool traditions, and settlement patterns for clues about when new populations may have entered the Southwest, cross-referencing these findings against the genetic and linguistic timelines. Each line of evidence alone told an incomplete story. Language could theoretically spread without a large population movement, carried by trade, by small groups of influential travelers, by cultural exchange rather than mass migration. But when a shared language family this precise is paired with distinct, traceable genetic lineages, the case for an actual population movement becomes extremely difficult to dismiss. Researchers now generally place the southern Athabaskan migration into the American Southwest, sometime within the last 1,000 to 1,500 years, though the exact timing and number of separate migration waves remains an area of active study. Some evidence suggests the journey may not have been a single dramatic crossing, but a series of movements, small groups traveling south over generations, some stopping in the Great Plains, others continuing on to the desert Southwest, gradually forming the distinct but related Apache and Navajo nations we recognize today. This raises one of the most fascinating open questions in the entire investigation. Why did they leave? What could compel a subarctic population to abandon a homeland their ancestors had known for generations and travel thousands of miles into landscapes utterly unlike anything they had known? Climate shifts are one possible factor, periods of change that reshaped resource availability across the north. Population pressure, competition for hunting grounds, and social or political upheaval among northern Athabaskan groups are other possibilities researchers continue to investigate. The honest answer is that we do not yet have a single confirmed cause. What the evidence does show, clearly, is the result. A population that made this journey, and in doing so, demonstrated a level of adaptability that would come to define their descendants in the southwest. Consider what this journey actually required. A subarctic people, skilled in surviving brutal winters, hunting caribou and moose, navigating dense boreal forest, would have had to cross the Great Plains, an entirely different ecosystem, before eventually reaching the deserts and mountains of the American Southwest, a landscape utterly unlike anything in their ancestral homeland. Along the way, they would have encountered other indigenous nations, exchanged knowledge, possibly formed alliances or experienced conflict, and gradually adapted their survival strategies to environments that shifted dramatically from ice and snow to grassland, to arid desert and high mountain terrain. This is not the journey of a people incapable of change. This is the journey of one of the most adaptable populations in the recorded history of the Americas. By the time Spanish explorers encountered Apache bands in the 16th century, that adaptability had been refined over centuries into an extraordinary body of desert survival knowledge. Apache bands understood water sources across vast stretches of arid terrain that outsiders considered nearly uninhabitable. They developed sophisticated tracking and hunting techniques suited to desert and mountain ecosystems entirely different from the forests their ancestors had known. They built social and political structures flexible enough to allow bands to split apart during times of scarcity and reunite when conditions improved. A structural echo, whether by memory or necessity, of the kind of flexibility a long migrating population would have needed to survive. In the next part of this investigation, we go deeper into the genetic evidence itself, examining exactly which lineages connect Apache and Navajo populations to their northern Dene relatives, what ancient DNA from southwest archaeological sites reveals about the populations already living there before Athabaskan speakers arrived, and what happened when these two very different histories, one northern and recently arrived, one southwestern and ancient, began to intertwine. Because the deepest twist in this story is not simply that the Apache came from somewhere else. The deepest twist is what happened when they got there, and how much of the ancient Southwest may still be carried inside communities the world thought it already understood completely. A journey of 3,000 miles does not erase what came before it, and it does not simply overwrite what it finds along the way. To understand what happened when Athabaskan-speaking ancestors of the Apache reached the Southwest, we first need to understand what and who was already there. The Southwest that these travelers entered was not an empty frontier waiting to be filled. It was one of the most complex cultural landscapes in North America, shaped by thousands of years of continuous habitation. Ancestral Puebloan communities had built extraordinary settlements across the Four Corners region, multi-story stone and adobe structures, sophisticated irrigation systems that turned arid land into farmland, and trade networks that stretched from the Pacific coast to the Great Plains and deep into Mexico. Turquoise mined in the southwest has been found in Mesoamerican archaeological sites hundreds of miles south. Macaw feathers from tropical Mexico have been found in southwest burial sites. This was not an isolated backwater. This was a hub of long-distance exchange connected to a much larger world. When small groups of Athabaskan speakers began arriving, likely over the course of several centuries and in multiple separate movements, they entered a landscape already organized around these established networks. What happened next is one of the more genuinely uncertain and genuinely fascinating parts of the story. Did early Apache and Navajo groups raid these established communities as later historical stereotypes might suggest? Did they trade with them? Did they intermarry, gradually blending genetic ancestry from the newly arrived northern travelers with ancestry already present in the region for millennia? The archaeological and genetic evidence increasingly suggests the answer includes all of these possibilities, occurring differently in different times and places, rather than one single simple pattern. Ancient DNA, recovered from pre-contact Southwest archaeological sites, when compared against modern Apache and Navajo populations, reveals something researchers did not initially expect. While the distinct Dene genetic signature is present and traceable, confirming the northern migration, it does not appear as an unmixed, isolated lineage. Instead, it appears layered alongside genetic markers connected to populations who had already lived in the southwest for thousands of years before Athabaskan speakers arrived. This is not evidence of one population simply replacing another. This is evidence of integration, of two distinct genetic and cultural histories converging over generations into something new, while the newer arrivals retained enough of their distinct language and ancestry to remain identifiably, unmistakably Dene. This finding forces a genuine reconsideration of how the formation of Apache and Navajo identity should be understood. These were not simply northern travelers who arrived, conquered, and imposed themselves wholesale onto an existing population. Nor were they a population that arrived and was fully absorbed, losing their distinct identity in the process. What the evidence increasingly points toward is something more nuanced. A relatively small founding population carrying a distinct language and genetic signature from thousands of miles north that grew over generations through relationships, alliances, and the incorporation of people from the communities they encountered along their journey and after their arrival. The Apache nation that Spanish colonizers eventually documented was not a population frozen in the exact genetic and cultural form it held when it left the subarctic. It was a population that had already been transforming for centuries, absorbing new ancestry and new knowledge with every generation, exactly as it would continue to do throughout the centuries of conflict and adaptation that followed European contact. This pattern of integration also helps explain one of the most distinctive features of Apache and Navajo history: the sharp cultural divergence between the two despite their shared linguistic origin. Both trace back to the same Dene-speaking migration from the north, and their languages remain closely related. Yet Navajo communities developed a settled agricultural lifestyle in the Four Corners region, building an economy centered on farming, sheep herding after European contact, and a complex system of clans, while Apache bands, particularly in the southern and eastern regions, maintained a more mobile lifestyle centered on hunting, gathering, and eventually raiding, adapted to the specific ecological and social conditions of the territories each group settled in. This divergence likely reflects different patterns of integration with different existing southwest populations, different environmental pressures across the vast and varied territory the broader migration eventually occupied, and centuries of independent cultural development following an initial shared origin. A single migration, arriving in a complex and varied landscape, giving rise not to one uniform culture, but to several distinct related nations, each shaped by the specific communities and environments they encountered. The genetic story becomes even more layered when we examine what happened after European contact. Spanish colonization introduced new pressures, new diseases, and new opportunities for exchange across an already complex genetic landscape. Some Apache bands intermarried with Mexican and Spanish settlers over generations of contact along contested borderlands. Captives taken during conflicts on both sides were sometimes adopted into Apache families, becoming fully integrated members of the community, their descendants carrying mixed ancestry while remaining culturally and politically entirely Apache. This is a pattern that appears again and again across indigenous nations throughout the Americas, a reminder that biological ancestry and cultural political identity are related but fundamentally different things. DNA cannot define Apache citizenship. It cannot determine who belongs to which of the many distinct Apache nations: the Chiricahua, the Mescalero, the Western Apache, the Jicarilla, and others, each with their own history, government, and identity. That authority belongs entirely to the Apache nations themselves. What DNA can do, and what it has done in this investigation, is challenge the flattened, one-dimensional version of Apache history that dominated textbooks and popular imagination for generations. The version that reduced an entire people to nomadic raiders who appeared suddenly on the desert horizon. The genetic and linguistic evidence instead reveals a population with one of the most remarkable migration histories documented anywhere on the continent. A journey of thousands of miles across radically different environments, followed by centuries of adaptation, integration, and transformation within a southwest landscape that was itself one of the most sophisticated and interconnected regions in pre-contact North America. In the next part, we will examine what happened when this long history of movement and adaptation collided with a new and unprecedented pressure, European and American colonization, and how the same qualities that allowed Apache ancestors to survive a 3,000-mile migration became the same qualities that made Apache resistance to conquest some of the most prolonged and effective in the history of the American Southwest. Because the deepest irony of the Apache story may be this: the very adaptability that outsiders eventually feared as unpredictable, ungovernable resistance was never a mystery at all. It was the direct inheritance of a people whose ancestors had already proven, across 3,000 miles and countless generations, that no single environment and no single set of circumstances could define what they were capable of becoming. The wars fought between Apache bands and Mexican, then American forces, spanning from the early 19th century into the 1880s, are often remembered as one of the longest and most difficult military conflicts in the history of the American West. What is less often understood is why. Historians and military officers at the time frequently expressed frustration at their inability to decisively defeat Apache resistance, describing bands that could seemingly vanish into the landscape, survive with minimal resources in terrain that outsiders considered nearly uninhabitable, and reorganize after devastating losses in ways that confounded conventional military strategy. This was not mysterious resilience. It was the direct expression of survival knowledge that had been refined and passed down across countless generations. Knowledge that originated, in part, in the adaptability required to survive a migration of thousands of miles through some of the most varied and challenging environments on the continent. The same flexible band structure that likely allowed small groups of Athabaskan speakers to travel independently, splitting and reuniting as conditions demanded during their long journey south, became a defining feature of Apache political and social organization in the Southwest. There was rarely a single centralized Apache leadership that outside forces could target to end resistance entirely. Different bands, often led by figures whose authority rested on demonstrated skill and the trust of their community rather than inherited title, could make independent decisions. One band might negotiate, another might continue resisting. This structure, so often described by outside observers as chaotic or disorganized, was in fact a sophisticated adaptation, one that mirrors, whether through direct cultural memory or convergent necessity, the same kind of flexibility a long-distance migrating population requires to survive unpredictable circumstances across vastly different territories. This is where the genetic and historical evidence together offer something more valuable than either could provide alone. They reveal that the qualities which defined Apache resistance in the 19th century were not a sudden, isolated response to colonization. They were the continuation of a much older pattern, a pattern etched into both the cultural memory and, the evidence suggests, the genetic history of a people whose ancestors had already demonstrated, across one of the longest confirmed migrations in the human history of this continent, an extraordinary capacity to adapt, to integrate, and to survive. What number affected you most? 1. The 3,000-mile migration from the subarctic connecting Apache ancestry to the Dene peoples of northern Canada. 2. The discovery that pre-contact Southwest populations were absorbed into, rather than simply replaced by, incoming Athabaskan speakers. 3. The divergence between Apache and Navajo despite their shared linguistic origin. 4. The role of intermarriage and captive adoption in shaping later Apache genetic ancestry. 5. The connection between long-distance migration adaptability and the resilience later shown during the Apache Wars. Or 6. The reminder that DNA can reveal population history but cannot define tribal citizenship, which belongs to the nations themselves. Write your number in the comments. If this investigation gave you a clearer picture of where your own family's story might connect to real documented history rather than assumption, I have put together a complete guide explaining exactly how to read consumer DNA results, what haplogroups actually mean, and where the limits of home testing begin. The link is in the description. In the next video, we travel to the Great Lakes to examine the ancient DNA of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, and one of the most remarkable genetic case studies in North America, a nation whose survival through centuries of warfare and epidemic was preserved not by isolation, but by an institution most outsiders never fully understood: the deliberate, systematic adoption of captives into the very heart of the Confederacy itself.